Elizabeth Flanagan. I work at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank Group in the Human Development and Corporate Sector. IEG, as we're known, we're an objectives-based evaluation unit. We evaluate all World Bank projects, IFC projects, and MEGA projects, the three arms of the World Bank Group. We also do sector and thematic evaluations, and we will have the distinct pleasure of evaluating all the projects that Varun has told you about, but at an objectives-based level, so what the development outcome, using, of course, his impact evaluation to triangulate for success. So I'll talk to you today about two things, putting the beneficiary at the center of development and also a framework for evaluating behavior change interventions in World Bank projects that we put together in IEG. The putting citizens at the forefront and at the center comes out just naturally from obviously what Varun said and from the framework that we developed years ago, I guess, in IEG now 3 years ago, under Marie, I have to say that. So, I just say, I first started thinking about this issue when I was on mission and I had the opportunity to sit and watch a group of women voting on participatory decision-making or voting on particular behaviors they wanted to see change in their community. This was a low birth weight trial, and behaviors affecting or impacting women were impacting nutritional outcomes and the intergenerational transmission of nutrition outcomes. And so it was just fascinating to see these women voting on which behaviors they wanted to address in the coming month or weeks. This was actually a DFID project. The two behaviors they chose in the end were behaviors of mother-in-laws and husbands on nutritional outcomes. And at these meetings, they would also be given conditional cash transfers and some fortified foodstuffs, and there was an impact evaluation that should be coming out. So it's very interesting to me. How IEG got involved in it was our work program is now organized around strategic engagement areas, and one of them is sustainable service delivery to the poor. And the thinking, of course, is that you need to change behavior, their outcomes, as Marie said, but also that I don't know, the adage, I don't know if you've seen the movie, Field of Dreams, if they build it, or if you build it, they will come. It's just no longer an operable solution. So, changing behavior, getting to the last mile. What we did was we took a retrospective. We just developed a framework and then looked backwards in the World Bank portfolio to see what kind of behavior change interventions the World Bank had been using in the past, so from 2000 to 2016 or so. And we developed a model, and we call it CRISP, and the categories we've discussed already this morning. Communication, how information is conveyed to individuals is very, very important. It's not enough to just be given facts and figures in a compelling way. Behavior change communication campaigns have been going on in the health sector for a very long time, but we don't know how effective they are. Resources, necessary but not sufficient for changing behavior. Again, information and incentives, the neoclassical model of economics, and then we have the behavioral society and psychology, or social and psychological factors. So these are the main categories that we developed to look back at the portfolio and to say, well, what has the World Bank been doing over the past years? Has it been focusing on this neoclassical framework? Are there any elements of behavioral economics? Certainly not the nice little nudges, the low-cost nudges that Varun was talking about, but is there anything in the portfolio? And we came up pretty much with the same conclusions. You need to identify and diagnose. And this is not just the constraints and the barriers and constraints to uptake of service delivery, but also how people are acting beforehand. So getting a sense of the context, as Varun said, is very, very important. Design and implement. So how the communication, the resources, the incentives, and looking for that feedback mechanism throughout implementation as well. So taking a check back and monitoring and evaluating at the end to see whether or not interventions were successful. The results frameworks, indicators are very weak along these measures. So we really don't quite have an understanding yet. So the citizen beneficiary, starting with sound diagnosis, we found that 20% or fewer of projects reviewed by the sector had conducted any kind of beneficiary analysis or any type of formative research. Things that were done, a lot of information in the background sections, but really little research on behaviors going into sectors. We looked at health, urban transport, and water and sanitation. I will say our water and sanitation sector was heavy on water irrigation systems and not so much on sanitation, so I have to caveat those findings. But projects need to recognize the wider behavioral constraints. The social constraints at the citizen beneficiary level were mentioned only 30% or fewer in projects, in contrast to resources, which were pretty much identified and provided in most projects. I'm going to go to the next one. So here's an example of something we found in the barriers and constraints to health utilization. So when we looked at the health portfolio, we found that promoting healthy behaviors and practices, increasing utilization, and increasing access and improving quality were the three behaviors the World Bank projects were trying to affect. And we looked at whether or not these barriers were identified in project documents, and then whether or not there was an intervention to address that barrier. And as you can see, resources both identified and provided, information and incentives still very heavily depended on, very few social factors, and almost negligible psychological factors. But health was probably more social factors in health than in the urban transport and water and sanitation, as I mentioned. So you can see it's still very heavily neoclassical at this point, looking backwards in World Bank projects. So focusing on the demand side, to increase utilization of services. I've mentioned the social and psychological. Monitoring and evaluation is very weak. We find that very few projects actually have indicators on outputs, what they would expect from these behavioral interventions. If at all, it would be launching an awareness campaign. There'd be no measure of awareness raising. And then there's nothing at the end for outcomes. So M&E is lacking in this area. So this is something that we need to correct and turn around. Urban transport, these are just the same findings. Weak M&E, heavy reliance on resources. Private transportation, there's an over-reliance on private transportation, and unsafe pedestrian behavior, driver behavior. Those are very common behaviors found, identified in the portfolio, but resource constraints were then recognized, or the interventions were resource-based. And the same with water, but as I mentioned, my sample was a little weak on that. So the one thing that I would say would be, if you take this ex-post evaluation tool that we've developed, this CRISP framework, you can turn the questions around and put them into design instead. So how is information communicated to beneficiaries? Turn it around to a question that a TTL could ask upon reflection in designing a project. How could I communicate this, what I need to beneficiaries? What resources are there? What resources do you need? And just thinking about these things up front. So it's not limited to an ex post or post hoc evaluation, but it could be used as a checklist for designing projects in the future to be more behaviorally informed. Of course, success would be design, implementation, and monitoring, evaluation of engagements that are behaviorally informed. So I think I had something else to say, but I'm going to stop there, if that's okay.